I'm Cikgu Kevin here. In this presentation, I will guide you on important events, notes, and explanation on the novel Dear Mr Kilmer for SPM 1119 Paper 2. It is very important for you to read the novel truly for better understanding on Dear Mr Kilmer novel. In this presentation, I will highlight the important events, causes, and effects. Before we proceed, I request you to take a piece of paper and take note on my presentation. If you have any questions, you can leave your comment or ask your English teacher. Let's look at some terms and meaning in both English and Malay for Malaysian students. The terms are event or incident, cause, effect, character, characteristics or qualities or personalities. Let's look at event or incident. It means what happened, or in Malay, peristiwa ataupun kejadian yang berlaku di dalam cerita tersebut. The cause, why did it happen? Mengapakah sesuatu peristiwa itu berlaku? The effect, kesan. Apakah kesan-kesan kepada watak-watak yang terlibat apabila sesuatu peristiwa itu berlaku? Character, watak di dalam sesebuah cerita. Characteristics, qualities or personalities, perwatakan, sifat ataupun kualiti seseorang watak. In this presentation, we will focus on event, cause, and effect. Your teacher will guide you on character, characteristics, qualities, or personalities. However, I will focus on character, characteristics, qualities, and personalities in my next video. Okay, let's look at event, causes, and effects in Dear Mr Kilmer. The event 1. Richard purposely missed shooting the buck. Buck is a young deer. Causes, Richard thought that hunting was not important. Second, Richard could not kill animals. The effects are, Goose, Richard's elder brother, was upset with Richard because Richard purposely misfired. Richard's father, Pa, was also disappointed with Richard. Pa asked Richard why he purposely missed shooting the buck. Richard told Pa that he had no right to kill it. Richard told Pa that he felt painful and sad to kill an animal. Pa told Richard not to go hunting anymore if he did not like it. So this is a very important event in the story. Whereas Richard did not want to kill the buck. The buck is a young deer. Therefore, he purposely misfired. And this made Richard's brother Gus angry with him. And Richard's father Pa was also upset with him. Okay, next event. Event 2. Richard wrote his first letter to Mr. Kilmer. The causes, Richard learned about Mr. Kilmer when Richard's English teacher, Mrs. Hanson, read a poem to the class. The title of the poem was Trees, written by Joyce Kilmer. Mrs. Hanson told the class that Mr. Kilmer is a famous poet. He worked for the New York Times. The New York Times is a publishing company. Richard regarded Mr. Kilmer as his new hero because Mr. Kilmer loved poetry and was brave to enlist in the army. Students, for your information, Mr. Kilmer is a surgeon working in the army, and his pastime is writing poems. Richard got Mr. Kilmer's office address. So what are the effects? In his letter to Mr. Kilmer, Richard told Mr. Kilmer that he wrote poems too. However, he kept this as a secret from everyone. He did not tell his family members or his friends. Richard asked for Mr. Kilmer's advice. He wanted to know whether he should tell his secret to everybody. This was how Richard became friends with Mr. Kilmer. They always exchanged letters with each other. Richard always sent a poem with his letters. Mr. Kilmer would praise Richard and make suggestions to improve the poem. The next event, event 3. Richard was the only student who signed a sympathy card for the schemers. Causes, Mrs. Henson asked her class to sign a card for the schemers. Someone vandalized the tavern owned by Hannah's parents. They painted dirty hands all over the walls. Dirty hands means something that is insulting word. Okay? Mrs. Henson brought a card to express regret for what had happened to Hannah's parents. Second, the troublemakers like Abner, Harry, Blanche, and Peggy refused to sign the card. Abner, Harry, Blanche, and Peggy are the classmates of Richard and Hannah. Number 3, they warned other classmates not to sign the card too. The boys were afraid Abner and Harry would hit them. The girls worried that popular girls like Peggy and Blanche would not speak to them. So what are the effects? After school, Richard took the card from Mrs. Henson. He wanted to give the card to Hannah. On Richard's way to Hannah's home, Abner and Harry was waiting to hit him. They called Richard a hun lover. Their cruel intention was in vain as Richard fought them back. They promised to leave Richard alone. Hannah accepted the card reluctantly. Later, Hannah apologized to Richard for being rude. This was the beginning of their friendship. Event 4. Richard told his family and Mrs. Henson that he wrote poetry. The causes, Richard received a letter from Mr. Kilmer. Number 2, Mr. Kilmer advised Richard to overcome his fear. Number 3, Mr. Kilmer advised Richard to share his poetry with people around him. So what are the effects after that? Number 1, nobody was interested. Goose did not believe that Mr. Kilmer was famous. Pa did not believe that Richard wrote poetry. Number 2, Richard asked whether his family members wanted to read his poems. However, nobody was interested and Richard was sad. Goose advised Richard not to tell anyone that he wrote poetry. He wanted Richard to fit in with other people. Everyone called him a hun lover after he signed the card for Hannah. The next day, Richard told Mrs. Henson that he wrote poetry. He showed her Mr. Kilmer's letter. Mrs. Henson helped Richard to choose a poem. Richard would send the poem to Mr. Kilmer. As advised by Mrs. Henson, Richard shared Mr. Kilmer's latest letter and his poem with the class. Some of his classmates, including Blanche and Peggy, were deeply moved by his poem. They started to respect Richard. Hannah suggested a different ending to Richard's poem. Event 5. Hannah declined the role of Lady Liberty. Richard declined his part as a doughboy. The causes: Hannah and Richard both won the roles of Lady Liberty and Doughboy, respectively, because they wrote the best essays. Mrs. Henson asked the class to write an essay as one of the activities for a patriotic program which helped sell Liberty bonds. Hannah wrote the best essay, so Mrs. Henson asked Hannah to read it. After she read the essay, only Richard clapped his hand. Many students were angry with Mrs. Henson's decision. They regarded Hannah as an unpatriotic German, although she was an American citizen. Some parents complained to the principal and demanded Mrs. Henson to choose someone else. Mrs. Henson did not change her mind. Hannah told Richard that her essay started a little war in Turtle Lake. Turtle Lake is a place where Richard, Hannah, and the others were living. She did not want to cause any more problems. Richard wanted to support Hannah. The effects are: number 1, Goose told Richard that all students said that he was unpatriotic and a traitor. Pa was disappointed when Richard declined the role of Doughboy. Pa advised Richard not to side with the shamers. Influenced by Abner's father's story, he thought that the shamers wanted the Germans to win the war. Richard told his father that the shamers are patriotic. They wanted the Allies to win. Hannah's brother Otto was an American soldier. Number 3, Hannah's friendship with Richard became stronger this time. Hannah invited Richard to her house. Richard got to know Hannah's parents. Richard visited the shamers whenever he felt lonely. The shamers understood his dreams. Richard shared Mr. Kilmer's letters with them. He read his poems to them. During Christmas, Hannah baked cookies for Mr. Kilmer. Mrs. Shamer knitted a scarf to cheer Mr. Kilmer up. Event 6. Richard wrote a poem as a tribute to Mr. Kilmer. Causes: Mr. Kilmer was killed in the war between the Allies and the Germans. Mr. Kilmer was Richard's pen pal. In the poem, Richard likened Mr. Kilmer to the world. The effects: the tribute was printed in the local newspaper, the Turtle Lake Weekly. Richard's father read the poem. Richard was afraid that his father was going to be angry with him. His father did not like Richard writing poems. After reading the poem, his father told Richard about what happened to Richard's uncle Roland. His father never told Richard about this story. Roland was killed in a war in Cuba. His father regarded Roland as his world. His father was amazed about Richard's determination on writing poems. Richard continued writing poems about farm life for the local newspaper. Richard got his father's help as he was an experienced farmer. Every night, Richard read his poems aloud. His father would correct or give suggestions to improve the poems. His father finally supported Richard's passion in writing poetry. So these are the events that happened in Dear Mr. Kilmer's novel. To summarize, these are the first event. Richard purposely missed shooting the buck. Richard wrote his first letter to Mr. Kilmer. Richard was the only student who signed a sympathy card for the shamers. Richard told his family and Mrs. Henson that he wrote poetry. Hannah declined the role of Lady Liberty. Richard declined his part as Doughboy. Richard wrote a poem as a tribute to Mr. Kilmer. That's all, students. So I hope these notes will help you in your exam paper. So I will see you in our next video. on the character and characteristics in Dear Mr. Kilmer's novel. Thank you so much for following me throughout this presentation. If you have any feedback or any suggestions, please leave your comment below. Thank you so much. We will see you again.